So our first speaker is Professor Jim Harris, Chair in Environmental Technology from Cranfield University. Jim is best known for his work in ecological restoration and systems ecology, particularly in characterizing the role of soil microbial communities to provide unambiguous signals of the state of ecosystems across the land's use spectrum. He has a broad set of interests, and this is a particular strength. Often insights from one discipline or area can galvanize another. And his work has informed the development of principles, guidance, and standards locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally. So Jim, he's here today to talk to us about conservation and restoration in a changing climate. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. I've got quite a lot to get through, but we're going to look at a number of questions. How are we going to set goals and measure success in this highly variable, complex, and changing world? How do we increasingly complex spatiotemporal dynamics that we've got in nature impact our efforts towards policy principles and guidelines, and how we're going to inform practice for conservation and restoration? Because things are changing so quickly, we need to be cognizant that we're going to have to be very fleet of foot. Can process-based dynamic measures allow for inevitable structural changes but still reflect ecological integrity? And ecological integrity in the systems view is one of the main threads that will be throughout my discussion today. And can we've got a number of diverse needs and perspectives really to take into account, and it gets very spiky when you get some ugly facts slaying some elegant theories. So we're faced with this moving biophysical envelope at the moment, and there's some really surprising work coming out at the moment showing just how this is happening. This is work from Tom Oliver and his group showing the likely shifts of butterflies. There's loads and loads of these for different species. And in the various climate prediction scenarios, we're looking at declines in the south and gains in the north. So immediately you start to question, well, what's happening in terms of on-site decision making as around particular species if they're being pushed? And some really startling news has come out in the last couple of weeks with a paper on looking at the impact of nitrogen pollution and deposition in Europe. And interestingly, what's happening here is the shifts from, because everyone's identifying and seeing this south to north shift in Western Europe. But actually, there's an even faster shift going on from east to west as a result of that intense deposition of nitrogen. And this is simply referring to the four map points, so north at the top, south at the bottom. And actually, they're detecting some quite intense rates of shift from east to west based on that nitrogen availability, which in some places in parts of the Netherlands can be up to 40 kilograms of nitrogen as nitrogen per hectare per annum as a result of simply what's coming out of the sky, never mind what's being put in on the ground. And they're explaining this by nitrogen deposition being incredibly powerful in this. And this is quite a startling result, I think. And the reasons for that is we have to think about the regimes within which niche space is available for individuals and for populations and communities. If we've got on the left, I've got stress adversity regime, and on the right, a disturbance regime, very much drawn from the work of Phil Grime. And the disturbance regime is around those things that are sudden point events that have big effects, could be fires, drought, flood, etc. And stress is the background, and obviously that shift in nitrogen is a big change in the adversity or carrying capacity of a site. So imagine we've got an actual niche occupied. The big green circle shows you the potential niche space across the normal range of stress and adversity and disturbance regime. And basically, as secondary succession takes place, the niche bounces around. And so the express niche is the current state of the system. But of course, what's now happening is that, so that bounces around, but what's happening now with the pressures of climate change, land transformation, and aerial deposition, we've got a lot of communities that are managed around a fixed point in terms of perhaps a species list or even an individual species often, but that envelope's moving. And that means we might be faced with the prospect of some of those sites that are managed around a particular species list or a particular organism or other feature. There's a danger that these will, short of Eden project type interventions all over the countryside, we're going to be faced with conditions that won't support them. But that means that there are potentially new niches and these spaces available to be able to move into. And the reason for this is that we're moving now, because of the rapidity of change, from this idea of sort of red queen environments where competition, predation, and other biotic factors shape ecosystems locally over short time spans to this Court Jester type scenario where extrinsic factors, climatic, oceanographic, and tectonic effects shape larger scale patterns. Now, of course, that's the sort of the multi-million year changes that you would expect, but of course, we're forcing them to happen very quickly. So we really need to be thinking smartly about what we're doing. We're moving from one to the other faster than evolution can keep pace with those changes. And often we hear about, and I hear a lot in certainly in North America, this idea of moving and restoring systems to some past condition, often linked to events around surveying, etc. But very often we're not quite sure what those systems would have been like anyway, let alone how they're going to work for us going forwards. There's a lot of work done around species lists as descriptions, but often we find ourselves using them as prescriptions, and we know that this is not going to be the only approach that's going to be useful in the future, because if you've simply got a species list, you could claim that something like this is an ancient woodland because it's got all the right species, but not necessarily at the right ages of development. You can plant something that might be an ancient woodland in several hundred years, but it's not a direct replacement at the moment. So what's our problem here? We've got further bits of things to consider in terms of what is it we're trying to achieve. And it might be that we've got this amazing vision of what the system is that we're trying to restore, what we're trying to restore to, and what the outcome would be, like this amazing figure of a human, Michelangelo's David. Unfortunately, because we don't know enough of exactly details of any ecosystem that we look at, we can end up with a design that's rather more like this. And of course, once we've designed and prescribed what's going on, we've got to implement it, and that can be really disastrous. So we need to think about how can we be flexible. We're looking essentially at a moving target. When I was started to work in restorations 40 years ago, goodness me, was it that long ago? The simple idea was you took the original system, it had been degraded, you put it back. That was restoration. You put it back as it was. But even under conditions of an unchanging biophysical envelope or planet, we would have faced the fact that if that system had been undisturbed, it would probably be different than it was then. And And so really we should be trying to restore forwards. And of course, with change, we need to be thinking about new assemblages of organism. So what we're trying to do in our NERC project, Restoring Resilient Ecosystems, is try to seek a new paradigm for ecological restoration, which goes beyond reference systems, agnostic as to prior assumptions of intactness, integrity, and system health. We intend to measure biodiversity, architecture, and multifunctionality, and try to identify determinants and measures of complexity and seek signals of emergent properties, especially resilience to perturbation across a range of trophic levels. And the theory behind this, and there's quite a bit of evidence supporting this as a view, is if we look at those inherent properties, description of the physical, biological, and chemical conditions, what this does is it produces the complexity of the site, and we're intensely interested in complexity and how that leads to function. And once we understand that, we can get to, well, what are the properties that are emerging? We know that complexity in systems can lead to all kinds of increases in function. Links between carbon and biodiversity now are increasingly well established. This was a piece of work about 5-6 years ago, doing a meta-analysis that showed that in almost every compartment of a woodland system, that as you increased the number of tree species, there was an increase in carbon in the system. If you look at the soil litter, roots, soil organic carbon, the tree above ground carbon, everything increased as you increase complexity, increase diversity and the complexity of the system. And it's not a new idea. It's not a new idea. It's an old idea. So St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, it's better to have a multiplicity of species than a multiplicity of individuals of one species. Just from observing the natural world, he was able to make this assertion. Too often we look at an individual component, and I suggest that we need to be looking at the whole system to understand what's going on with the whole system. So as we suggest that looking at different compartments, this is what we're doing in ResReco. We're looking at how that plays out in terms of the complexity of each of those compartments, what that brings in terms of an emergent property. But going beyond that, what we're trying to do is get to the overall complexity of the system. How do we make these complexity metrics make sense in relation to one another so that we end up with one metric to bind them all? Hopefully we're not going to end up in the crack of doom. We're going to be able to find some system property that we can measure that will give us an indication of the state functioning and, if you like, health of the ecosystems that we're trying to manage and moving into systems that we want to restore to. We need to be very cognizant of scale. What is it? What part of the system are we looking at? If we look at only part of the system, we're going to observe some of the complexity, perhaps, if we're looking at 3 or 4 different groups of organisms or 3 or 4 species, but we're not going to be able to detect any emergent properties at that scale. As we go up, the scale of inspection increases, we can get a bit more of an idea of the complexity, but little, if any, of the emergence. It's only until we're observing the whole system that we can really know what's the complexity, what's the emergent properties going on here. So we're looking at woodland sites in Scotland and England. We're looking at grassland sites in southern England, and we're looking at post-industrial and post-agricultural landscapes. We're looking at the role of the interactions of those at scale. We're looking at age, we're looking at complexity, we're looking at distance to propagule source, and we're hoping to come up with the kind of observations that we've had in the past from microbial studies, that you can actually increase complexity by interventions. In this case, these were some sites that had been stripped back to their sand um, surface, the subsoil surface, because of the huge amounts of nitrogen that you get in the Netherlands, as we've seen on that earlier slide. And by doing an intervention when we actually introduced soil, we could get, after 4 years of restoration, because typically in the Netherlands and other parts of Northern Europe, the approach is very much build the field and they will come. Well, this is actual interventions, and we got increasing complexity of interactions between plant taxa and fungi. So currently what we're interested in is this whole concept of resilience and critical slowing down, because critical slowing down will give us an indicator of when we need to intervene. In a stable system, if you take this sort of cup and ball approach, what we find is that there is, as you have disturbances, that you've got a system that's very stable and resilient. Then there's little autocorrelation, i.e., if you have a disturbance, the following disturbance has basically not linked to the previous one, and you get no increase in variance. Whereas if you've got something close to the transition, then the system becomes very fragile. And what you get in that right-hand one there is these autocorrelations. So the disturbances and the signal that arises from them are linked. And the best analogy that we've got for this, that my colleague came up with, was, imagine you've got a perfectly flat road and you're driving an old clunker Cadillac along it, and it's got speed bumps. It hits the bumps, and after about 2 or 3 bumps, it just falls to pieces. Brand new Jeep, clunk, clunk, clunk. And the reason for that is the Cadillac has remembered the previous perturbation. Whereas the Jeep has forgotten it. So this is really important. If we've got systems close to transition, then a series of perturbations will start to make them more and more unstable before they collapse. And it's used in things like cardiology. It's used in bond markets, as an indication of something's about to happen. So we've been using Landsat data since 2000. We're going through a lot of denoising, and we're very close now to perfecting this. But what we found was that in 6 grassland sites, as part of our study, we found that since about 2015, 2016, we're increasingly seeing that autocorrelation signal coming out, where successive droughts have led to an increase in both the autocorrelation, i.e. the system in effect still being affected by the previous perturbation, the previous drought, and not able to respond without this increasing variance going on. So could we use this to triage sites, and where would we act? Where would we intervene first? We're currently doing that and tidying the system up to see where would we act to try and prevent the kind of critical state change that we've seen in Loch Ness. Can we lay over our sites a sort of a green, amber, red system, where we say there are some sites where we've simply got to intervene right now if we're going to save them. There are sites where we just need to continue monitoring. And there are other sites where we might want to say, hold on, I think they've gone past the point. We need to think of an alternative system that we might be able to restore to, that will enable resilience in terms of the sort of species blind but important high biodiversity metrics and system function. There's lots of examples out there of the kinds of systems that we might be interested in. This is work of Eric Higgs, where you can look at whether you're looking at ecosystem-centric systems, and you're looking at the composition, or if you're looking at human-centric systems. And he's come up with a way of thinking about these in terms of, our systems self-assembled? Can we look at those? Can we provide ways in which either we can restore to historical states because we know what they were and they are resilient, or do we need to think about novel systems? So take a look at the latest niche for British Ecological Society. We've got something in there explaining our thinking behind the considering novel ecosystems, because it's perhaps time to think that in some places we want to see the same play, but we accept that we may need some different actors to help us with putting that play on. Thank you for listening.